November 1st, 1944, dawned cold and misty over the dense Hurtgen forest along the German-Belgian border, where 20,000 American soldiers prepared to enter what would become one of the most brutal and overlooked battles of World War II. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with autumn rain, concealing an enemy that had transformed the forest into a deadly fortress of bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire that would claim nearly 33% of every unit that entered. Private First Class Robert Connor of the 28th Infantry Division clutched his M1 Garand rifle as his company assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. The 19-year-old from Pennsylvania had only been in Europe for 6 weeks, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on every man's shoulders like the low clouds that obscured the treetops. Intelligence officers had briefed them on their objective: capture the village of Schmidt and secure the Roe River dams beyond, preventing the Germans from flooding the entire Roe Valley and halting the Allied advance into Germany's industrial heartland. What the intelligence reports failed to convey was the nightmare geography of the Hurtgen itself. The forest stretched across 50 square miles of ravines, ridges, and nearly impenetrable woodland where visibility rarely exceeded 10 yards. The canopy was so thick that artillery airbursts normally devastating in open terrain detonated in the treetops, sending razor-sharp wooden splinters scything through the air like nature's shrapnel. Foxholes offered no protection from this arboreal death raining from above. Captain James Simmons, a veteran officer who had survived North Africa and Sicily, knew the odds were stacked against them, according to military historian Charles MacDonald's account in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, published by the U.S. Army Center of Military History. American commanders had grossly underestimated both the terrain's difficulty and the German determination to hold every meter of their homeland. The forest had already swallowed the 9th Infantry Division whole in September, spitting out survivors who spoke in whispers about tree bursts, hidden pillboxes, and minefields so dense that entire platoons simply disappeared. The German 7th Army, commanded by General der Panzertruppen Erich Brandenberger, spent months fortifying their positions. Concrete bunkers connected by communication trenches created a defense network that turned conventional infantry tactics into suicide missions. The Wehrmacht soldiers, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, understood forest warfare in ways that American troops trained for open European battlefields could not imagine. As dawn broke on that first day of November, the artillery barrage began. Hundreds of guns unleashed a thunderous preparation fire that was supposed to soften German defenses. The sound rolled across the landscape like continuous thunder, and for 30 minutes, the Americans watched as explosions rippled through the forest ahead. But when the barrage lifted and whistles blew, ordering the advance, Private Connor and 20,000 of his comrades would discover that modern warfare's most sophisticated weapons meant little in a primeval forest where survival depended on instinct, luck, and the unbreakable bonds between men facing impossible odds together. The first American units crossed the line of departure at 0700 hours on November 1st, 1944, moving in column formation through narrow forest trails that funneled them into German killing zones with mechanical precision. Within minutes, the carefully planned attack dissolved into chaos as machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions that artillery had failed to touch. Sergeant William Chapman of Company K, 28th Division, watched 3 men in his squad fall before anyone spotted the pillbox firing on them. The concrete fortification, covered with earth and vegetation, blended perfectly into the forest floor. Its MG-42 machine gun could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, and the German crew inside possessed overlapping fields of fire with at least 2 other bunkers. This was the reality of the Hurtgen, an enemy you rarely saw until after they'd killed someone beside you. The forest swallowed sound in strange ways. A firefight 300 yards away might be completely inaudible through the dense vegetation, while the screams of wounded men carried with crystalline clarity. Private Connor's company lost its way within 2 hours of starting their advance. The maps proved useless in terrain where every clearing, every draw, every stand of trees looked identical to the last. Compass bearings meant little when you couldn't move in straight lines through the undergrowth. By noon, the 28th Division's attack had stalled completely. Companies reported 50% casualties in some platoons. The German defenders employed a tactic of letting lead elements pass then opening fire on following units, cutting off resupply and reinforcement. Wounded men lay for hours waiting for medics who couldn't reach them through the interlocking fire lanes. The forest floor, already soft from autumn rains, churned into freezing mud under thousands of boots. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Barsante, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 109th Infantry Regiment, established a command post in a ravine 400 yards from the jump-off, point barely a tenth of the distance the unit was supposed to have covered. Radio communication with regiment headquarters broke down as the forest and terrain blocked transmissions. Runners became the only reliable means of communication, and German snipers quickly learned to target anyone moving between positions. The first night in the Hürtgen tested men's sanity. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Soldiers in summer weight uniforms huddled in shallow foxholes scraped from the forest floor. German patrols infiltrated American positions under cover of darkness, and the forest amplified every sound into potential threats. Men fired at shadows, revealing their positions to real enemies. The crack of tree bursts continued sporadically through the night, as German artillery maintained harassing fire, the airbursts turning pine and fir trees into deadly fragmentation weapons. Private Connor spent that first night pressed against the bottom of his foxhole, sharing the space with another soldier whose name he couldn't remember in the darkness. They took turns sleeping in 15-minute intervals, each man convinced he would die before seeing sunrise. Around them, the sounds of the wounded crying for medics mixed with German voices calling out in English, trying to draw Americans into revealing their positions. Captain Simmons counted his company at dawn on November 2nd. Of the 190 men who had crossed the line of departure 24 hours earlier, only 134 answered roll call. They had advanced less than half a mile and were nowhere near their objective. And this was only the beginning of what would become a 3-month battle that military historians would later call America's Verdona meat grinder, that consumed entire divisions while accomplishing objectives of questionable strategic value. November 5, 1944 marked the point where the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest transformed from a tactical operation into a test of human endurance against industrial-scale violence. The 28th Division, now 5 days into the offensive, had suffered 2,500 casualties, more than 12% of its strength, while gaining less than 3 miles of contested forest. The weapons technology of World War II created particularly horrific conditions in the Hürtgen's confined spaces. German artillery crews, positioned on the high ground beyond the forest, fired into the canopy with mathematical precision. The Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, called Screaming Mimes by American troops for their distinctive shrieking sound in flight, proved especially devastating. Each 6-barrel launcher could deliver 45 kilograms of high explosive in a concentrated salvo, and when those rounds detonated in treetops above American positions, the results were catastrophic. Corporal Michael Durante, of the Medical Detachment, 110th Infantry Regiment, witnessed injuries that no training had prepared him for. Men arrived at aid stations with wooden splinters driven inches into their bodies, puncturing organs and severing arteries. Others suffered from what the medics called tree burst syndrome, victims of pressure waves from overhead explosions who showed no external wounds but died from internal hemorrhaging. Durante worked 8-hour shifts in a dugout aid station that received a steady stream of casualties, performing triage by flashlight while German artillery searched for their position. The forest itself became weaponized through the extensive minefield network the Germans had laid during their months of preparation. Shoe mines, small wooden boxes containing just enough explosive to blow off a foot, were nearly impossible to detect with standard mine detectors. The Germans scattered them by the thousands along trails, clearings, and stream crossings. Engineers attached to each regiment worked around the clock to clear paths, but the process was agonizingly slow, and lethal one mine-clearing specialist in 3 became a casualty. According to the after-action reports compiled by the 1st U.S. Army and later analyzed in the U.S. Army War, College studied the Hürtgen Forest, the battle, and its significance. American tactical doctrine proved fundamentally unsuited to forest warfare. Infantry units trained to maneuver in open terrain with tank and artillery support found those advantages nullified by the claustrophobic environment. Tanks that did enter the forest became trapped on narrow trails, easy prey for German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons fired at ranges of 30 yards or less. Staff Sergeant Thomas Grayson, a tank commander in the 12th Tank Battalion, is lost. 3 Sherman tanks in a single morning, trying to support infantry near the village of Wassenach. The forest trails were too narrow for tanks to maneuver or traverse their turrets effectively. German infantry teams stalked them from the undergrowth, waiting for the perfect moment to fire rocket-propelled grenades into the thin side armor. Grayson's crew survived by abandoning their vehicle and fighting as infantry, a common fate for American armor and the Hurricane. The weather deteriorated as November progressed, adding a new dimension of misery. Rain fell constantly, turning the forest floor into a morass that sucked at boots and made every movement exhausting. Soldiers developed trench foot by the hundreds as they stood for days in waterlogged foxholes without opportunity to dry their feet. The cold and wet combined with combat stress to create what medical officers called combat exhaustion, a condition that left men catatonic, able to function despite showing no physical wounds. Private Connor, now a veteran of 6 days of continuous combat, no longer resembled the fresh-faced replacement who had entered the forest. His uniform was caked with mud that never dried. He had learned to sleep while standing, to eat cold rations without tasting them, and to distinguish the sound of incoming artillery by the pitch of its flight. Most importantly, he had learned that survival in the Hurricane required suppressing every natural human instinct for self-preservation and simply continuing to function in an environment designed to kill him. November 9, 1944 brought the 28th Division to its operational breaking point as the battle for Schmidt and Commerchet reached its crescendo. The division, now designated by survivors as the Bloody Bucket for the red keystone on its shoulder patch, it penetrated 5 miles into German defenses, but found itself overextended, surrounded on 3 sides, and fighting for survival rather than victory. The catastrophe unfolded in the killing grounds around Schmidt, a small village that had changed hands twice in 72 hours of savage close-quarters combat. The 112th Infantry Regiment, tasked with holding the village, found itself cut off when German forces recaptured the Kahl River Bridge, the only supply route connecting Schmidt to American lines. What followed was a nightmare of urban warfare, complicated by the surrounding forest that prevented reinforcement or resupply. Lieutenant Robert Flegg, commanding what remained of his platoon in Schmidt's ruins, counted 18 men still capable of fighting from the original 42 who had entered the village 3 days earlier. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The wounded, lacking morphine or proper bandages, made sounds that haunted men for the rest of their lives. German counterattacks came in waves, supported by assault guns that fired directly into buildings at point-blank range, collapsing entire structures on defenders inside. The Kahl River Gorge became a graveyard for American attempts at relief. Engineers tried desperately to repair the bridge under constant artillery fire, while infantry units attempted to force crossings at other points. The gorge's steep sides and the river's icy water created a natural fortress that German machine gunners exploited mercilessly. Bodies accumulated on the approaches, and wounded men drowned in the shallow water, too weak to pull themselves onto the banks. Colonel Karl Peterson, commanding the 112th Regiment, faced an impossible decision. His regiment was disintegrating. Radio contact with isolated companies had ceased. The divisional commander, Major General Norman Cota, ordered him to hold Schmidt at all costs, but Peterson could see that maintaining the position meant the annihilation of his regiment. On November 10th, against orders, he authorized a withdrawal. What followed was less a tactical retreat than a desperate flight for survival. Companies that had maintained cohesion through days of combat dissolved into small groups of men trying to find their way back through the forest they had fought so hard to penetrate. German forces pursued aggressively, and the withdrawal through the Kahl Gorge turned into a gauntlet where men threw away weapons and equipment to scramble up the muddy slopes. Private Connor's company, positioned on the flank of the withdrawal route, provided covering fire until German infantry threatened to envelop their position. The order came to fall back, and Connor found himself running through the forest, branches tearing at his uniform, lungs burning in the frigid air. Behind him, the sound of gunfire intensified as the German pursuit closed in. Men around him fell, but there was no time to help them, no time for anything but the animal instinct to survive. The retreat from Schmidt cost the 28th Division another 2,000 casualties, bringing their total losses to over 6,000, nearly a third of the division's strength in 10 days of fighting. The division was pulled from the line on November 13th, combat ineffective and requiring complete rebuilding. They had failed to capture their objectives, failed to secure the road dams. and paid an astronomical price for gaining a few miles of devastated forest. Captain Simmons, one of the few original company commanders still alive and functional, assembled what remained of his unit in a rear area. The faces looking back at him belonged to strangers' replacements, who had arrived during the battle and somehow survived, plus a handful of original men who seemed decades older than they had been 2 weeks earlier. He tried to write letters to the families of the dead and missing, but found himself unable to explain what their sons and husbands had died for in the green hell of the Hürtgen Forest. November 15th. 1944 found the U.S. First Army's headquarters grappling with the tactical disaster unfolding in the Hürtgen Forest. The 28th Division's withdrawal had created a gap in the American line, and fresh divisions were already moving forward to continue the offensive that had consumed so much blood for so little gain. The 2nd and 8th Infantry Divisions prepared to enter the same forest that had destroyed their predecessors. Major General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, positioned nearby, questioned the entire strategic rationale for the Hürtgen offensive in his private journals. The Rodams, ostensibly the campaign's primary objective, could be neutralized by air power or simply bypassed. The forest itself held no strategic value. Capturing it meant occupying terrain that favored defenders and hindered every advantage American forces possessed in mobility, armor, and air support. But Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding First Army, remained committed to the offensive. His reasoning reflected a mindset prevalent among Allied commanders in late 1944. Germany was on the verge of collapse, and maintaining pressure across the entire front would hasten victory. The forest had to be cleared because it was there, because it represented a threat to the First Army's right flank, and because American doctrine demanded offensive action. The 2nd Infantry Division entered the Hürtgen on November 21st with the confidence of a unit that had distinguished itself from Normandy to the German border. Their commander, Major General Walter Robertson, believed his troops could succeed where the 28th Division had failed by employing better tactics and maintaining momentum. Within 72 hours, the 2nd Division discovered that the forest was an equal opportunity destroyer of military units. Regardless of their prior combat record, Technical Sergeant Paul Bosch, leading a platoon of the 308th Infantry Regiment, experienced the same nightmare that had broken the 28th Division. The Germans had not withdrawn after defeating the earlier American offensive. They had reinforced their positions and learned from the fighting. The pillboxes still dominated key terrain. The minefields still channeled American advances into killing zones. The artillery still turned the forest canopy into a weapon of mass destruction. What made the 2nd Division's battle particularly tragic was that many of its soldiers understood they were repeating mistakes that had already proven catastrophic. Platoon and company commanders shared tactical lessons through informal networks, warning newly arrived units about specific German tactics and dangerous terrain. But military bureaucracy and the pressure to maintain offensive momentum meant these hard-won lessons rarely reached the staff. Officers planning the operations, the small unit leadership that emerged in the Hürtgen, represented American combat infantry at their finest and most tragic. Sergeants and lieutenants, many of them promoted in the field to replace casualties, developed tactics that worked in the forest's unique conditions. They learned to advance in small teams with maximum dispersion, to navigate by terrain features rather than maps, to recognize the subtle signs of German defensive positions before stumbling into them. Private First Class Francis Curry of Company K, 320th Infantry Regiment, demonstrated the kind of initiative that kept men alive in the Hürtgen. On December 21st, near Malmedy, Curry single-handedly knocked out 5 German machine gun positions and a 6-man bazooka team during a German armored counterattack. His actions, for which he would later receive the Medal of Honor, exemplified how individual soldiers adapted to forest combat when the larger tactical situation had devolved into chaos. But individual heroism could not overcome fundamental strategic and tactical failures. The forest continued to consume American divisions at a rate that shocked even hardened military planners. The 2nd Division suffered over 5,000 casualties in December. The 8th Division, thrown into the meat grinder in late November, lost similar numbers. Each division that entered the Hürtgen learned the same lessons at the same terrible cost, and those lessons died with the units or were ignored by the staff officers planning the next offensive. The medical system struggled to cope with the flood of casualties. Aid stations operated under near constant artillery fire. Ambulances attempting to evacuate wounded often triggered mines or came under direct fire. Many casualties died not from their initial wounds but from hours of exposure to cold and wet while waiting for evacuation that never came. Medics like Corporal Durante worked until they collapsed, then worked some more, knowing that stopping meant men would die who might otherwise survive. December 1st, 1944 marked the beginning of the coldest winter Europe had experienced in decades. And for the American soldiers still fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, the weather became an enemy as lethal as German artillery. Temperatures plunged below freezing and stayed there, while snow accumulated in the forest, creating a landscape of deceptive beauty that concealed the same death traps that had claimed so many lives in autumn. The 70th Infantry Division, fresh from training in the United States and untested in combat, received orders to enter the Hurtgen in early December. Private First Class Richard Brookins, a 20-year-old from Ohio, remembered the confidence with which his division approached the forest. They had trained extensively, their equipment was new, and their officers assured them that German resistance was weakening. Within a week, Brookins would watch his platoon disintegrate under the same combination of factors that had destroyed every unit before them. The winter conditions added new dimensions of suffering to the Hurtgen's catalog of horrors. Soldiers' wet uniforms froze solid at night, and men woke with ice in their hair and beards. Weapons malfunctioned as lubricants congealed in the cold. The M1 Garand rifles that American infantry depended on jammed if moisture froze in their mechanisms. German weapons, designed for Eastern Front conditions, functioned more reliably in the freezing temperatures. Trench foot cases exploded as soldiers stood for days in foxholes where water accumulated and froze. Medical officers treated thousands of cold weather injuries, many requiring amputation of frost-damaged toes and feet. Ironically, some soldiers welcomed trench foot evacuations as their ticket out of the foresta. Self-inflicted wound without the courts-martial consequences of deliberate self-mutilation. Supply lines through the forest became increasingly difficult to maintain as snow covered the already primitive trails. Jeeps and trucks bogged down in mud beneath the snow, and many supplies had to be hand-carried forward by exhausted support troops. Food often arrived frozen solid. Ammunition resupply became irregular, forcing combat units to ration rounds even during active engagements. The winter created a logistics nightmare that compounded every other difficulty the forest presented. Captain William Penna, a supply officer with the 4th Infantry Division, performed near miracles, keeping ammunition and food moving to forward units. His supply convoys ran a gauntlet of German artillery and periodic ambushes to reach positions that changed locations daily as the front lines shifted. Penna lost trucks and men regularly, but maintained the flow of supplies that kept combat units functional. Without the work of officers like him, the fighting units would have ceased to exist as effective forces within days. The psychological toll of winter combat in the Hurtgen exceeded even the physical hardships. Men who had endured weeks of combat found their mental reserves exhausted by the combination of fear, cold, hunger, and isolation. Combat exhaustion cases multiplied, and medical officers struggled to distinguish between soldiers who genuinely could not continue fighting and those who were simply at the end of their bed. Endurance, but might recover with brief rest. Sergeant David Thompson, a squad leader in the 9th Infantry Division, watched strong soldiers break down and weep uncontrollably, unable to stop shaking even when pulled from the line. Some men became catatonic, staring straight ahead without responding to questions or commands. Others developed psychosomatic blindness or paralysis with no physical cause. The human mind had limits that the Hurtgen Forest exceeded with methodical efficiency. German defenders suffered similarly from the winter conditions, but they possessed advantages that American attackers lacked. The Wehrmacht troops fought from prepared positions with overhead cover, reducing their exposure to weather. Their supply lines were shorter, running through German territory where civilian infrastructure remained intact. They defended familiar ground, knowing the terrain intimately and understanding how to exploit it against attackers. By mid-December 1944, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest had consumed approximately 24,000 American casualties killed, wounded, or missing, with combat exhaustion cases adding thousands more. The territorial gains remained minimal, measured in miles of devastated forest that held no strategic value. Yet the offensive continued, driven by institutional momentum and the conviction that Germany's final collapse was imminent, if only sufficient. Pressure could be maintained across the front. December 16, 1944, shattered the grinding stalemate in the Hurtgen forest when German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the massive counteroffensive, through the Ardennes that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The assault transformed the strategic situation overnight, suddenly making the bloody fight for the forest a secondary concern as German panzers thrust toward the Meuse River, threatening to split the Allied front in two. The Hurtgen suddenly became a backwater as units that had been fighting there received emergency orders to redeploy southward to meet the German breakthrough. Battalions that had been ground down to company strength evacuated their hard-won positions, leaving behind the graves of thousands who had died capturing terrain that no longer mattered in the strategic calculus. Private Connor, incredibly still alive after 6 weeks of forest combat, found himself on a truck convoy racing south through snow and ice to reinforce the collapsing American line in Belgium. The irony was not lost on the survivors. They had endured the Hurtgen's nightmare, only to be thrown immediately into another desperate battle without rest, reinforcement, or proper equipment for winter warfare. Some units remained in the Hurtgen sector, however, as first Army headquarters feared the German offensive might be a feint to draw reserves away from a follow-up attack through the forest. The 2nd Infantry Division, still fighting near the village of Wallerscheid, at the northern edge of the forest, found itself directly in the path of supporting German attacks intended to protect the main offensive's northern flank. The fighting around Wallerscheid in the days following December 16th demonstrated that American soldiers had learned to survive and even prevail in the forest despite their earlier defeats. The 2nd Division, though badly weakened by weeks of attrition, held its positions against fierce German attacks. Small unit leaders who had survived the earlier battles employed the hard-won tactical lessons, using the terrain and vegetation that had cost so many American lives to ambush German infantry attempting to infiltrate their lines. Lieutenant Colonel Richard McKee, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 38th Infantry Regiment, orchestrated a defense that would have been impossible for the Green units that first entered the Hurtgen in November. His men, reduced to half strength and equipped with whatever weapons they could scavenge from casualties, held a 2-mile stretch of front against repeated German battalion strength attacks. They survived by being meaner and more resourceful than their opponents, turning the Germans' own defensive tactics against them. The Battle of the Bulge's initial success vindicated, in a grim sense, the German decision to defend the Hurtgen forest so tenaciously. By tying down American divisions in a protracted forest battle, the Wehrmacht had prevented First Army from establishing strong reserve positions or accumulating the forces needed to respond quickly to the Ardennes offensive. The 24,000 American casualties in the Hurtgen had purchased German time to prepare their winter counteroffensive. As 1944 ended, the Hurtgen forest fighting gradually wound down. Not because either side achieved decisive victory, but because both armies redirected their attention and resources to the larger Battle of the Bulge. The forest, now silent except for occasional patrol actions, held the frozen bodies of thousands of American and German soldiers who would not be recovered until spring thaw. Staff Sergeant Bosch, pulled from the line with what remained of his platoon, reflected on the wastage he had witnessed. Of the 40 men he had led into the forest in late November, only 11 walked out. The others were dead, wounded, missing, or broken by combat exhaustion. They had captured several square miles of devastated woodland and a handful of ruined villages. The strategic objectives, the Roh dams, remained in German hands, and German engineers could still flood the Roh Valley whenever they chose. The survivors carried psychological scars that would never fully heal. Many developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, suffering nightmares and flashbacks for decades after the war. The sound of wind in trees, the smell of pine forest, even the sight of certain shades of green could trigger panic attacks in men, would seem completely normal before entering the Hurtgen. Medical personnel who served in the forest's aid stations carried their own trauma. Corporal Durante, evacuated in mid-December suffering from combat exhaustion himself, could not escape the memories of men dying under his hands because he lacked the supplies or expertise to save them. The triage decisions, choosing which wounded men might survive treatment versus those too far gone to help haunted him for the rest of his life. January 10, 1945 brought a bitter cold morning to the rear areas where survivors of the Hurtgen Forest gathered for rest and refitting. The Battle of the Bulge still raged to the south, but for the soldiers pulled from the forest, there was a brief interlude to process what they had endured and to integrate the replacement troops who would fill the gaps left by 6,000 casualties per division. Captain Simmons, promoted to major and given command of a composite battalion formed from the remnants of 3 shattered companies, faced the challenge of building a combat-effective unit from traumatized veterans and untested replacements. The veterans, hollow-eyed and jumpy, knew too much about war's realities. The replacements knew nothing but would learn soon enough when the battalion returned to combat. The U.S. Army's institutional response to the Hurtgen disaster began, even while fighting continued. Staff officers prepared after-action reports that would eventually fill thousands of pages, analyzing what went wrong and identifying lessons for future operations. But these reports, when they reached operational commanders, often arrived too late to prevent other units from repeating the same mistakes. Lieutenant General Hodges, commanding 1st Army, never publicly acknowledged that the Hurtgen offensive had been a strategic blunder. In his view, maintaining pressure on German forces justified the casualties, regardless of whether specific tactical objectives were achieved. This perspective, common among senior Allied commanders in late 1944, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the forest's nature and the German defensive advantages there. Major General James Gavin, in his post-war memoir On to Berlin, would write critically about the Hurtgen campaign, questioning why Allied commanders persisted in attacking through terrain that negated every American advantage in air power, armor, and artillery. His critique represented a minority view among senior officers, but resonated with junior officers and enlisted men who had fought in the forest and survived to question the wisdom of their sacrifice. The German perspective on the Hurtgen battle revealed that Wehrmacht commanders considered their defensive success one of the war's greatest achievements. With relatively modest forces occupying strong defensive positions, they had inflicted disproportionate casualties on attacking American units while buying time for the preparation of the Ardennes offensive. German after-action reports praised the forest terrain and weather as force multipliers that offset American material superiority. The psychological impact of the Hurtgen experience shaped American tactical doctrine for the remainder of the war. Units that had survived the forest developed an institutional knowledge about forest warfare, small unit tactics, and the importance of combined arms coordination, even in restricted terrain. These lessons propagated through the replacement system as veterans shared their knowledge with newly arriving soldiers. Private Connor, now a corporal after battlefield promotions replaced fallen sergeants, found himself teaching forest warfare tactics to replacements who would join his unit for the final push into Germany. He taught them to move slowly and carefully, to never bunch up, to listen for the distinctive sounds of German weapons that might provide warning before opening fire. Most importantly, he taught them to trust their instincts and the men beside them, because in forest combat, survival depended more on small unit cohesion than grand strategy. The Hurtgen Forest fighting officially ended in mid-February 1945, when American forces finally captured all their original objectives, including the row dams. By that point, the forest had consumed portions of 8 American divisions, inflicted approximately 33,000 casualties, and become one of the most costly battles in U.S. Army history, measured by casualties relative to forces engaged. The territorial gains, less than 50 square miles of devastated woodland, seemed pathetically inadequate compensation for such losses. Medical facilities throughout the European theater of operations continued treating Hurtgen casualties months after the battle ended. The physical wounds, the amputations from mine strikes, the brain injuries from tree bursts, the frost-damaged limbs requiring surgical intervention represented only part of the medical burden. The psychological casualties, men diagnosed with combat exhaustion or neuropsychiatric disorders, were numbered in the thousands and required specialized treatment that the military medical system struggled to provide. February 23, 1945 marked 3 months since the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest had begun. And while the shooting had largely ended, the human consequences continued unfolding across 2 continents as wounded soldiers returned home and families received devastating news about sons and husbands who would never return. The casualty notification process revealed the battle's scale to the American public. Small towns across the United States received multiple telegraph messages in single days, informing families that their loved ones had been killed, wounded, or gone missing in a forest most Americans had never heard of. The concentrated casualties in particular units meant that some communities lost entire cohorts of young men who had enlisted together in 1942 and 1943. Mrs. Eleanor Connor received a telegram in late November informing her that her son Robert had been wounded in action in Germany. The telegram provided no details about the severity of his wounds or his prognosis, leaving her in agonizing uncertainty for weeks until a letter arrived from Robert himself, written from a field hospital in Belgium. He assured her he would recover. The wounds were relatively minor, shrapnel in his leg and shoulder, and he expected to return to his unit soon. He did not tell her about the nightmares that now woke him screaming, or about the friends who had died beside him in the forest. The Distinguished Service Cross and Silver Star citations that emerged from the Hurtgen battle told stories of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Soldiers who had held positions against overwhelming odds, medics who had repeatedly exposed themselves to fire to save wounded men, junior officers who had led desperate counterattacks to save surrounded units. The medal citations documented heroism that would have seemed fictional if not verified by multiple witnesses. Private First Class Francis Curry's Medal of Honor, awarded for his actions at Malmedy on the forest's edge, represented the apex of recognized valor, but thousands of acts of equal courage went unrecorded and unrewarded. Men who died performing heroic actions received posthumous medals that arrived at their families' homes months after burial services had concluded. The medals provided little comfort to parents, wives, and children who would have preferred their loved ones alive rather than honored as heroes. The replacement system that kept American divisions combat effective, despite horrendous casualties, created its own tragedies. Young soldiers arrived at the front with minimal training, were thrust into veteran units where they knew no one, and often died before learning the names of the men in their squad. The survivors remembered them, if at all, as that replacement who got hit on his first day rather than as individuals with names, families, and futures that would never be realized. Sergeant Thompson, recovering from wounds received in December, struggled to write letters to the families of men killed in his squad. What could he tell them that would provide comfort? That their sons had died heroically? Most had died randomly, victims of artillery they never saw, or mines they never detected. That they had died for an important objective. Thompson himself questioned whether capturing a few miles of forest justified the losses his unit had suffered. The German casualties in the Hurtgen, though less thoroughly documented than American losses, were also substantial. Wehrmacht units defending the forest suffered from the same artillery, mine strikes, and small arms fire that killed Americans. German soldiers died far from home, defending territory they knew Germany would eventually lose. Motivated by duty, fear of consequences for surrender or desertion, and loyalty to comrades beside them. The civilian population in the forest region paid their own price for the battle fought across their land. Villages like Schmidt, Wassenack, and Germoder were reduced to rubble. Civilians who had not evacuated found themselves trapped between armies, killed by artillery, or shot as suspected resistance fighters. The forest itself bore scars that would remain visible for decades: shattered trees, cratered ground, and the deadly legacy of unexploded ordnance that would claim lives for years after the war ended. The psychological wounds of the Hurtgen survivors manifested in various ways over the following decades. Some men never spoke about their experiences, burying the memories so deep that even family members knew only that Dad was in the war without details. Others could not stop talking about the forest, reliving their experiences in constant repetition that alienated friends and family who could not understand the intensity of their trauma. May 8, 1945 brought Victory in Europe Day, marking the end of the war that had consumed Europe for 6 years and cost tens of millions of lives. For the survivors of the Hurtgen forest, the peace brought relief, but not resolution. They had survived an experience that would define them for the rest of their lives, and they would spend decades processing what they had endured in those dark weeks between November 1944 and February 1945. The historical legacy of the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest evolved over subsequent decades as military historians grappled with its significance. Unlike Normandy, the Bulge, or the Rhine crossing, the Hurtgen never captured public imagination or featured prominently in popular histories of World War II. It remained what veterans called it, the forgotten battle, a meat grinder that accomplished little at enormous cost. Charles MacDonald, who fought in the Hurtgen as a company commander and later served as the U.S. Army's chief historian, devoted significant portions of his professional career to documenting and analyzing the battle. His work, including the detailed study published by the Army Center of Military History, provided the most comprehensive analysis of what went wrong and why American forces suffered such disproportionate casualties relative to territorial gains. MacDonald's conclusion was damning. The battle should never have been fought as it was. The original strategic objectives, securing the road dams to prevent German flooding of the Roe Valley, could have been achieved through other means, including aerial bombardment or simply bypassing the forest entirely. The decision to fight for the forest itself reflected a failure of strategic imagination and an underestimation of how terrain and weather could neutralize American material advantages. The tactical lessons from the Hurtgen influenced U.S. Army doctrine development in the post-war period. Training programs incorporated forest warfare modules emphasizing small unit tactics, the importance of reconnaissance, and the dangers of terrain that restricted mobility and observation. The battle became a case study in how not to conduct offensive operations in restrictive terrain against a determined defender. For the survivors, peace brought the challenge of reintegration into civilian society. Private Connor returned to Pennsylvania in July 1945 and attempted to resume the life he had left behind in 1943. But the young man who had entered the Army at 18 had disappeared in the Hurtgen forest, replaced by someone who, startled at loud noises, could not sleep without nightmares, and found civilian concerns trivially insignificant compared to the life and death struggles he had survived. The veterans. Administration hospitals treated thousands of Hurtgen survivors for physical and psychological wounds over the following decades. The medical understanding of combat trauma evolved gradually, but even with improved treatment, many veterans never fully recovered from their forest experience. The diagnosis, combat exhaustion, eventually gave way to post-traumatic stress disorder. But the underlying reality remained unchanged. The Hurtgen had broken something in these men that could not be completely repaired. Captain Simmons, who had survived the entire battle and led his battalion through the final battles in Germany, turned to his pre-war teaching career, but found the classroom unbearably confining after years of commanding men in combat. He eventually transitioned to Veterans Affairs work, helping other survivors navigate the bureaucratic challenges of obtaining benefits and medical treatment. His work provided meaning and purpose that teaching literature to disinterested students could not match. The 50th anniversary commemorations in November 1994 brought aging survivors back to the Hurtgen forest for the first time since the war. The forest had recovered its peaceful appearance, new growth had replaced the shattered timber, and only careful observers could spot the remaining signs of battle: shell craters overgrown with moss, foundation stones of destroyed buildings, and the occasional rusted helmet or cartridge case. The American military cemeteries in the region hold thousands of graves marked and unmarked, testament to the battle's cost. Some families never learned what happened to their loved ones, listed as missing in action because their bodies were never recovered from the forest. The missing in action lists from the Hurtgen include hundreds of namesmen who simply vanished in the chaos of forest combat, buried by artillery, lost in the confusion of retreat, or captured and killed without record. The final assessment of the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest must weigh tactical failures against individual courage, strategic waste against soldier sacrifice. The men who fought there displayed extraordinary courage under conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. They fought not because the strategic objective made sense, but because they were ordered to fight, and because abandoning their comrades was unthinkable, regardless of the mission's wisdom. Corporal Robert Connor lived until 2008. Dying at age 83, having carried his Hurtgen memories for 63 years. In his final years, he occasionally spoke about the forest to grandchildren old enough to understand. He told them that survival had been mostly luck, being in the right place when artillery fell, choosing the correct path through a minefield, having a tree burst explode 20 yards away instead of directly overhead. He told them that the friends who died were no less brave, no less capable, no less deserving of survival than those who made it out. They were simply unlucky, and in the Hurtgen forest, luck mattered more than anything else. The Battle of the Hurtgen. Forest remains a sobering reminder of war's reality, that courage and sacrifice cannot compensate for strategic errors, that terrain and weather can nullify technological superiority, and that the human cost of military operations must be weighed against achievable objectives. The 33,000 American casualties purchased lessons that would benefit future soldiers but provided no comfort to the families who lost sons, fathers, and brothers in a forest that most Americans never heard of, fighting for objectives that historians still debate 7 decades later.